the supermarket is a wonderful area where music is used in a most non-musical way for creating new kinds of participation. One of the phrases used in the Muzak circle is to say, we don't play music, we play programming. Now, the supermarkets are typically deluged with the sounds of popular romantic melodies and dances of 20, 25 years earlier, when the well-heeled matron was a young gal. She prances about with her buggy in the supermarket to the sounds that she romanticized to in her youth. And she's quite unaware of this, except as a delightful situation which completely melts all resistance to canned goods. Canned music and canned goods meet in a wonderful new wedding.
House music, that marvelous thing that gave us so much of our chamber music literature, and which still is something that causes me to walk miles in order to participate or to listen. I think we're seeing a return to house music. I see this with my own children. I see it with friends' children, where a new interest in music has been brought to bear, brought to life, by virtue of this mechanical reproduction.
I think we all, of course, one way or another, strive for immortality, either through children or through public performances of music. But the fact that it is quite possible that eventually all human experience and emotion might be simulated either chemically or psychologically, Brave New World kind of thing, I think shouldn't alter our efforts to avoid this. There's a kind of dehumanizing quality about all of this, and the eventual prospects that we face with the perfection of reproduction, mechanical reproduction of records, or even human reproduction for that matter, that I think is terribly frightening. And I think that when this moment comes, humanity will be ready for the floods again, will be ready for self-destruction.
I'm working in the field of communication. A magazine to me is a communications instrument. I always remember that people who read magazines are people who listen to records, who go to art galleries. They must have something that the professional, by the nature of his inner direction of his work, does not need. Barbarism never sleeps. We no longer have invasions across frontiers of barbarians. We have them coming up from below in a vertical mass. The effort in all communication media is constantly to lower and vulgarize the tone. I hope the creative artist stays enough in the marketplace to keep his tone high. If he becomes too private, if he becomes too isolated, he leaves my audience, the audience that all communications people, pretty much in the dark. I hope this doesn't happen.
If music within the studio can produce something that recreates itself in terms of something fresh for the listener, but then you're always running a great risk. You've got them in the concert hall. You've got them there, and they've jolly well got to behave. And if you want to be like Schnabel, you can say, stop coughing. But if you've got them where you don't know, in their own drawing rooms, living rooms, kitchen sinks, scratching their heads, picking their teeth, and talking through the music, how do you know you're ever going to reach them? This is the only benefit of the concert hall. You've got them there, pinned down like butterflies impaled on nice, sharp pins. And they're just not going to do what you don't want them to do. When you're reaching them across a microphone, or what I would do, I would have some kind of paralytic fluid that would pin them down, that would come through the screen and come through whatever the what do they call those things? Well, I don't know, air, waves. I'm so bad about machines, I don't know what they do. And pin them there. And they'd have to listen.
Recordings offer two possibilities. One is to record, as the word suggests, for posterity, the best performances by the greatest artists of the particular time. And this is, to me, the most essential side of recording. But I think that another side of recording has been rather overlooked to date, and that is that records can be a medium of entertainment starting from within themselves. Now, whether or not one liked those records, which introduced a thing called ping-pong sound in stereo, where the sound jumps from one speaker to another, they were designed as entertainment for the general public looking for popular music. The same really applies to the Sing-Along series. Sing-Along was designed for records, for people who wanted to sit at home and sing along with those songs. It was original as an idea, and it was really a thing designed for records only, and it worked.
It worked for an astonishing length of time. It worked for something like 4 years. Of course, you can't give them away now. But they sold something like 9 million of these albums.
Dialogue on the prospects of recording. 1 hour and 25 minutes of fervent conviction and furious debate about recordings and the modern world. Provoked, written, and narrated by Glenn Gould. Taped, spliced, tweetered, and woofered by Irving Glick. Featuring the candidly mic'd and callously edited opinions of Schuyler Chapin, Ludwig Dean, John Hammond, Marshall McLuhan, Paul Myers, Diana Menuhin, and Robert Offergeld. With the unwitting musical presence of Lucas Foss, Dick Reimacher, Frank Martin, Henri Pousseur, and Igor Stravinsky, all of whose royalty accounts will be accordingly enriched, as, but for the ravages of time and the inconsistencies of ASCAP, would be that of Ludwig van Beethoven.
That marvelous performance of Beethoven's Eighth Symphony was recorded 30 years ago in Vienna by the late Felix Weingartner. For at least half of those years, since I was a teenager and first made its acquaintance, it has, for me, eclipsed all other performances of that work. It's become the yardstick against which I measure all others that I hear. Recordings do that. They insinuate themselves into our judgments and into our lives. They're capable of giving the people who make them, the engineers, the artists who perform on them, and more recently the composers who write with them in mind, an awesome power with which to influence the lives of those who listen to them. And this is a power which was simply not available to any earlier generation of musicians. It's a power uniquely responsive to the electronic technology of our day, and it's this power that we examine tonight. We cannot describe the condition of our culture without taking into consideration the media through which its products are made available. In the last half-century, electronic media have drastically altered the effect of music upon our society. Music surrounds us today as it has never done before. Music comes out of speakers in our homes and in our cars. Music provides background for the images on our television screens, helping those images sell us things which we know we don't need. Music is piped into restaurants to relieve us of the nuisance of conversation, into public places to make us less riot-prone, into elevators to make us less claustrophobic. Music, it seems, is calculated to complement an enormous range of activity and to provide an emotional backdrop against which we can play out our lives. Well, if we were to take inventory of those musical predilections that are most characteristic of our generation, we would discover, I think, that almost every item on such a list could be attributed, in some degree at least, to the influence of the recording. First of all, our generation values a sound of great clarity, immediacy, almost tactile proximity, a sound that was neither available to nor wanted by the musical profession or public of 2 generations ago. Within a few brief decades, music has ceased to be an experience separated from life and accorded, when encountered, an almost religious devotion. Music has become so pervasive an influence in our lives that as our dependence upon it has increased, our reverence for it has perhaps declined. Our grandfathers' generation preferred that their occasional experience of music be fitted with an acoustic halo, cavernously reverberant if possible, perhaps to resemble the cathedral-like sound which the architects of that day tried to capture for the concert hall, the cathedral of the symphony. But the more intimate terms of our musical experience have compelled us to develop an acoustic which is a direct and impartial presence, and with which we can live on rather more casual terms than was possible in earlier times. Here's a sound that has something to do with the musical persuasion of the present. was recorded in a large studio, which is, as a matter of fact, a converted church, but for the purposes of that recording, the largeness of the studio was immaterial. The microphone was placed very close to the instrument and was not, as is sometimes the case, given backing in depth by microphones placed at greater distance from the recording area and left open simultaneously. Every effort was made with that recording to cultivate an acoustic of extreme intimacy, so that the frame of sound which would accompany the piano onto disc would very much resemble the acoustic in which it would most likely be replayed by the person who buys the recording, the acoustic of the living room. Here's another recording of a piano in which quite different ideals prevail. Here, the microphones are obviously at a great distance from the instrument, perhaps to avoid intruding their physical presence upon the performer, and thus disturbing him and his audience. Because this recording was not made in an acoustically controlled and perhaps rather hermetic studio, but in a public concert hall. And it's quite clear from the sound of this recording that the artist and his instrument are being placed on a rather lofty pedestal, in the presence of the worshiper, in this case, the audience. Those two recordings, the first was made in New York in 1960, and the second was made in Sofia, Bulgaria, and also in 1960. But the initiative of their producers and engineers is directed in each case toward a very different aim. The first recording aimed to find a niche in the intimacy of the home. The second aimed to evoke the memory of a concert experience and make it available for a listener at home. And the philosophies behind those two recordings are as different as the historical, geographical, sociological circumstances of the cultures from which they came. The New York recording was aware of a public that to an extraordinary extent had discovered music because of the recording. The Bulgarian recording was concerned with pleasing a public which had grown up with and presumably wished to be reminded of the proper sound of music in a public auditorium. The New York recording assumed an interest in a sound experience more or less indigenous to the media of recording. Because of the proximity of its mechanical ears, it could analyze and fragment the sound that was being transmitted. The Bulgarian recording made no such assumption as that. It was at great pains to refrain from analysis, and it sought only to capture as best it could the aura of the original experience. In the New York recording, the men in the booth presiding over the session were crucial to the success of the session. Their concept of the sound appropriate to the music being performed, and of the way in which the microphone could dissect for the listener aspects of that performance, required not only good judgment and musical sensitivity, but a primary faith in the medium itself. The Bulgarian crew, off stage in the wings, I guess, of some palace of municipal amusement, made no such claims for the autonomy of their craft. They sought only to pursue it as an inconspicuous complement of performance. The making of a recording is a very precise and a very complicated operation, and with each year it becomes more complicated as new mechanical procedures are made available to the recording studio. Records are made under the supervision of producers who normally consort with the artists who are involved with them, both in regard to planning the repertoire which will be recorded, and to some degree at least in regard to the way in which it should be done. In the earlier days of the recording industry, the producer was very much the valet of the artist, very much more anonymous than he is today. The present-day producer is part impresario. He usually undertakes to establish a long-range plan about the sort of repertoire that the artist intends to record. He's also part technical engineer, since he must define the objectives of sound which he feels to be pertinent to the particular project. And the acoustical objectives of the recording are as variable as the temperaments of the individuals involved. In general, one can say, though, that the present ideal of recorded sound in North America leans toward a reproduction of precise definition and of great analytic clarity. In Central Europe, on the other hand, many producers and technicians still prefer that more ambiguous, even cavernous sound, since they're persuaded that their audience is an older, more tradition-minded public which looks to the recording as a supplement of experiences in the concert hall. There can be no doubt, though, that the present trend toward a sound of extreme definition is dominant in the recording field, and that the possibility of such sounds has exercised a tremendous influence both on the manner of performance and, in some cases, on the manner of composing. Many contemporary compositional techniques owe a great deal to this highly analytic disposition of the microphone. Paul Myers is a young recording producer who's greatly enthused about the possibilities indigenous to the medium. Like many of his generation, he views the recording as entirely separate from the concert experience, and he's determined to uncover ways through which its separateness, its autonomy, can be utilized.
My only reaction is that all electronic equipment should be used as a tool to achieve whatever result you want, and that should this be a desire to achieve a harder attack and so on, then it should be used, and that we would be foolish to keep improving the technique of recording and not to make use of it in any way that we want. I think one of the glories of music is that every performance is a little different, and that no two conductors, no two pianists will ever play the same piece exactly the same way, and in the case of many artists, they will play the same piece slightly differently on each different occasion. This is what makes music so interesting, and this is why many people listen to it. And I would see no harm in having a performance of a Beethoven symphony with a Klemperer first movement, a Karajan second movement, a Toscanini third movement, and a George Self finale. I think this is a quite justifiable thing to do, because I think we should get away as much as possible from the age of the personality and the assumption that because so-and-so is a good musician, he is the only musician to play a particular work. Our real interest should be in the music itself.
John Hammond, who has been producing records since the early 1930s, takes a rather less optimistic view of the present acoustic trends. He believes that a concept of fidelity to the artist, to the composer, and, above all, to the prior memory of the public listening experience should be paramount.
Well, I feel that what has happened to recorded sound is something that can be summed up in the word inflation. I think the reasons for this are perhaps the egos of the artists. I believe that the soloist rather prides himself in being able to be heard over 100 pieces, or that the delicate flute or the oboe or the English horn likes to feel that he can and should be heard far more closely than the concert audience will hear him in an orchestra. In a string quartet, very often nowadays, I'm sorry to say, 4 microphones are used, what with stereo, and if you play back a string quartet recording, you'll see that the viola player is standing by his speaker, and the cellist by his, and the first and second violin by theirs, and they're all very happy with what they hear. In emphasizing the parts, you so often destroy the unity of the whole, and my feeling is that people who are not musicians in recording very often can take over the role of the musician. That is, the engineer, and some of our engineers are wonderful musicians, some know from nothing about music. Some of our producers are good musicians, some of our producers are ex-tape editors. It's a matter of taste, I suppose. And my feeling is that most recording by the major companies of symphony orchestras are so cluttered with microphones, and engineers are so careful to give equal importance to all the voices that composers' wishes are almost invariably flouted. Of course, as far as recorded sound is concerned, there's another great difficulty we have in recording, and that is that most engineers like to play back tapes at a superhuman volume. Popular artists love to hear this great mass of sound. Of course, their ear gets deadened and they can't possibly hear details this way. But the ego is tremendously served.
You know, one of the saddest things that's happened over the years, and this is especially true of record critics or reviewers, is that they play every record and they have extremely expensive equipment costing $1,000 and up, with controls which will do practically everything except turn the record over, and they never touch them. They play every record at exactly the same setting. If a listener at home would prefer to hear more treble and less bass, there seems to be no reason in the world why he shouldn't use the dials that have been put on his machine. And I think that we could welcome any machine that could slow down or speed up a performance or change the sound, which the home listener could then alter, because he's buying the music to entertain himself or to elevate himself or whatever it is. He should be able to hear music exactly the way he wants to hear it. The record companies cannot guess everybody's tastes. They should produce the records to the taste of the artist, since he is the person on the cover of the album. This should be his album. But at the same time, the listener should not feel restricted and should not feel that he must listen to it that way merely because the artist wants it that way.
Coming back to this whole question of presence, I'd like to go back some 35 years or so, because as a child, although I went to a lot of concerts, I started collecting records around 1924. And among the first records I ever collected were those of the pianist Walter Gieseking. I think around 1930 I heard Gieseking in the flesh in his second American concert tour. And I was terribly disappointed when I heard him in concert. He was a very powerful man. He had extremely small nostrils, and he snorted. And I could never understand why the recordings sounded so wonderful. Well, we go to 1939, and I'm working for the American Columbia Company, and for the very first time we were able to record Gieseking in this country. And I thought, I'm going to get, finally, why Gieseking sounds better on record than he does in the flesh. Well, when we were balancing for this date, because of the snorts, we found out that we had to move the microphone further and further back, and this was done with Mr. Gieseking's blessing. And in fact, I believe he said never was the microphone less than 22 feet from the microphone. Actually, I think it was 26 feet with us, and we recorded the second book of Debussy Preludes, and there were no snorts. The sound of the piano was limpid, was ethereal, everything that Gieseking's sound was not in the concert hall.
Well, there's another thing that we'd have to add to our list of contemporary enthusiasms: the fantastic revival of Baroque music, music of the early 18th century, particularly in the years following World War II. This extraordinary catalogue of cantatas and concerto grossi, fugues, and partitas, which in the last 20 years particularly have found their way from the recording studio to the listener's living room, has endowed the neo-Baroque enthusiasm of our day with a hard core of musical experience. Much of this music has then found its way back into the concert hall and re-engaged the attention of the public audience, but it's done this by virtue of the recorded library of these works, a library that enables them to be studied in great number, in great privacy, and in an acoustic which fits them to the proverbial T. It may be that the cultivation of earlier literature, like that of the Baroque, has recommended itself to a substantial part of today's audience, and professionals too, for that matter, as a means of avoiding some of the problems inherent in the music of our own time. There are so many similarities between the structural premises of Baroque music and of the post-tonal music of the 20th century that one can entertain a reasonable suspicion that the Baroque revival provides a sort of refuge for those who find themselves as displaced persons in the frantically metamorphosing world of modern music. Be that as it may, the ideas about the presentation of Baroque music, on recordings especially, have a great deal to do with the way in which we've learned to perceive and to analyze contemporary music. The analytical theories of such men as Arnold Schoenberg, perhaps the leading radical of music in the 20th century, have become so influential that we often apply them with some modification to our study of music from earlier times. The method of analysis, which has developed from Schoenberg's theories, deals on the whole with relationships so interior to the musical structure that only through the intercession of electronic media can they be projected with an appropriate definition and clarity. Schoenberg's own music provides a good illustration of the way in which the recording can influence the interpretive intention. It can fairly be said that Schoenberg's music didn't really come into its own until the advent of the long-playing record. Even today, his music, apart from the earliest pieces, is seldom given in concert, but a large percentage of it has now been committed to records. Most of the orchestral music in the Schoenberg canon is being recorded under the baton of the young American conductor Robert Kraft, and these recordings tell us a good deal about the degree to which a performance prepared exclusively for the microphone can be influenced by the technological achievement. Here's a sample of Kraft's rendition of Schoenberg's Opus 5, his superb tone poem, Pelléas and Mélisande. Here, for contrast, is part of the same section from the same work, performed in a recording made in 1949 by Winfried Zillig and the Frankfurt Orchestra. Where Kraft applied a sculptor's chisel to that vast orchestral complex and gave it a determined series of plateaus on which to operate rhythmically and harmonically, which is a very Baroque thing to do, Zillig's performance seems caught up in the fine rapture of it all. It's a much more romantic conception than Kraft's. But more than a temperamental contrast between the two maestros is in evidence here. Certainly age and background play their part in these strikingly contrasted interpretations. Nor can one overlook the vastly improved studio techniques to which Kraft's was accommodated. But more than anything else, the real difference between these two performances is that Zillig's was clearly conceived as a concert experience. His leisurely application of rubato, the sensual haze of which he gilds the performance, as though aware that clarity were some enemy of mystery, all these things point to the origin of his interpretive concept. Kraft's, on the other hand, was planned and executed solely as a recording. His performance takes into account the intimacy and directness with which its replay will be encountered by the listener. Kraft's design for this piece responds to an intuitive understanding of the media. It assumes that much imagination will be brought to the encounter by the listener. His interpretation is all power steering and air brakes. But Zillig's assumes that those gentler retards, those more casual tempo fluctuations, are all part of a necessary compensation employed by musicians seeking to present such complex music to a public audience. In order to integrate the rhythmic and motivic complexities within this diffuse music in the concert hall, Zillig accepts a less analytic involvement. Kraft, on the other hand, is fully aware that his audience, sitting at home close up to the speaker, is prepared to allow him to dissect this music and to present it to them from a strongly biased conceptual viewpoint, which the circumstance of their listening, the privacy of it, the concentration it allows, make feasible. So this, then, is one way in which the recording has given the interpreter a sense of power. Because his work is being viewed from close-up, through the intercession of the microphone, he's able to fragment the interpretation to a degree never attainable or desirable in the concert hall. The example from Schoenberg's Opus 5 was in some ways a rather awkward choice, I guess, since such late romantic repertoire doesn't necessarily benefit by this kind of fragmentation. It wasn't conceived in the way that Baroque music was, and as a great deal of contemporary music, for that matter, is, as something to be presented in the home. It's becoming clear, though, that a great deal of music composed in recent years presents acoustic problems which can only be properly solved in a recorded performance. Here's one such work, the Petite Symphonie Concertante by the Swiss composer Franck Martin, which is scored for string orchestra and 3 solo instruments, piano, harp, and harpsichord. The soloists combine to afford registrational possibilities such as are virtually unworkable in any but the smallest concert hall and with any but the most self-effacing soloist. On record, however, it's an altogether different matter, as this superb blend achieved by Deutsche Gramophone's engineers in a performance supervised by Dr. Elsa Schiller and conducted by the late Frank Frickschei illustrates. I defy anyone to duplicate that consort of instruments successfully in a concert hall. Other composers do write works which utilize the technical achievements of electronic media so completely that they eliminate the function of the performer altogether. In these works, the composer, in a sense, is the performer as well, although it's sometimes necessary for him to seek assistance from technicians who may specialize in some aspect of electronic control. Such a specialist is Dick Reimacher, who is both a composer himself and a technical assistant to other composers, notably Henk Badings, who officiates as director of the Philips Electronic Studio in the Netherlands. Reimacher's own compositions are relatively uninteresting as music, but absolutely fascinating as controlled sound. They're produced with an incredibly precise sonic definition, a sharp focus of outline not always realized in electronic music, and the clarity of the sound operating at sharply etched dynamic levels very clearly suggests spatial distances. This sort of music, drafted by a man who is primarily an engineer and only secondarily a composer, is concerned with aural effect in much the same way that the current enthusiasm for painting, which cultivates purely optical illusion, is in many cases contrived by designers who are more concerned with proving a principle of optic control than with creating a work of art as such. Many of the constructive methods that seem so far, at any rate, indigenous to purely electronic music have transferred with remarkable ease to contemporary idioms of conventional instrumental and vocal expression. The reiterated note pattern with a measured crescendo and diminuendo, the dynamic comparisons between close-up and far-distant statement of the same figuration. Above all, the possibilities for immediate release and attack of sound. All of these motifs have to some extent been borrowed by the post-Webern idiom, which so decisively controls our composing experience at the present. And a good example is Henri Pouzeur's score Elect, which welds conventional instruments and pure electronic sound patterns into an extraordinarily homogeneous composition.
Reste. Oh, reste. Je l'attends, sans me lasser. Mais pourquoi? S'il veut revenir, pourquoi ne se montre-t-il point? Courage, enfant. Courage. Du haut des cieux, l'Éternel. Vois et gouverne tout. Dans mon propre palais, je suis tolérée comme une étrangère. Misère vêtue, je me tiens à la table abandonnée.
Crie lamentable au retour.
Crie d'horreur sur la cour royale.
Quand ton père les coups tranchants de la perfidie.
Grand Dieu! Grand Dieu! Inflige aux coupables un supplice vengeur.
En garde.
Laissez-moi. Laissez-moi, consolateur. Je ne cesserai plus mes imprécations. Si ce meurtrier ne subissait pas le châtiment qu'il mérite, pour toujours, le fait de l'honneur des mortels et de la piété. Évite est parti surveiller le travail des choux. En son absence, expliquons-nous.
Our catalogue of the musical enthusiasms of the present makes clear that electronic reproduction of music has already very subtly begun to alter the ways in which we perform and compose. But much more important than that, it's begun to alter the ways in which we react to music. Sometimes it's said that the attainment of music in our lives has become too easy, that music is too accessible to be meaningful. People who hold this opinion usually feel put out by the fantastic development of what we've come to call background music, music which is planned, prepared, and packaged in advance in order to complement a certain mood or a certain state of mind or a particular physical circumstance. It aims for what one can only call aesthetic neutrality. It attempts to harmonize with as many environmental situations as possible and to minimize our awareness of its own intrusion and character. The stylistic range of most background music is quite variable when one relates it to conventional, serious music of recent times. Such background music as is designed for commercial images on television or for restaurant muzak is pretty well confined to harmonic and rhythmic idioms which, at their most advanced, might perhaps draw upon the cliches of Impressionism. On the other hand, the musical background of many grade B horror thrillers coming out of Hollywood these days draws upon an advanced range of harmonic idiom, and indeed, under the cover of background material, some not altogether insignificant scores have found their way into the listening experience of people who otherwise would have found them highly disagreeable. Even here, of course, they do this under the cover of neutrality. It's axiomatic in the composition of movie background that its success relates in inverse proportion to the listener's awareness of it. There's a curious relation between these two facets which we've just discussed, between the neutrality of this background vocabulary, the unobtrusiveness of its contribution, and the fact that most background music is conveyed through the process of recording, because in fact these are two complementary facets of the same phenomena. Because the recording does not depend, as the concert does, upon the mood of an occasion, of a particular circumstance. because it can rely upon relating to a general set of circumstances rather than attaining a specific pertinence. It can achieve its relevance to the contemporary sales imagery by exploiting those abilities through which it's able to draw without embarrassment upon an incredible range of stylistic reference, summoning to the contemporary world idiomatic devices of much earlier times, placing them in a context in which, by according them a subdivided participation, they achieve a new validity. The net result of music as background material is that through an associative procedure that nobody really understands very clearly, it becomes adopted as part of a larger pattern of action. Those who believe that background is a sinister influence assume that it's capable of reducing all who are exposed to it into proponents of its own vast cliché. But this is precisely the point. Because it does infiltrate our lives from so many different angles, the cliché residue of as many idioms as are employed in background becomes an intuitive part of our musical vocabulary. And consequently, in order to gain our attention, any musical experience has to be of a quite exceptional nature. One man who spent a good deal of time posing various aspects of this question is Robert Offergeld, the music editor of Hi-Fi Stereo Review.
Anybody who spends much time alone listening to a recording in his own room, sooner or later gets to a strange, rather strange feeling about music as a result of it. Music is something which, when it's drained of what I've already called historic presence or historic date, the accidentals that attend it. The conductor comes into the hall, it's a damp night, there was a subway strike on that night. The conductor comes in, he feels the personality of the audience like a sort of damp Newfoundland dog looking mournfully at him. It's bound to affect his performance. So, all of this is ruled out the minute you're alone in your own ideal room with your own ideal performance. You begin to see this music sort of passing before you as a frieze under very ideal conditions. With all the presence in the world, all the three-dimensional feeling, all the depth, and so forth, it still is an idealized version of this. It's not subject to any accidentals, and there comes a point where there's a touch of something hallucinatory about this. You are deliberately cut off from a great many ordinary affairs, which you are not when you are sitting in a concert. If you record for a live performance in a hall, I recall in particular one that I've always used for an example in such cases. I think it was a recording made in Covent Garden by Charles Joplin and Boris. It's one of the most exciting records in the world. It's not only a musical performance, there's a very unmistakable sense of a historic occasion there. It was a certain night in a certain year. You hear the sea of presence of the audience out there in the dark, an occasional cough. But you also hear, or sense, perhaps with some sixth sense, the effect this was having on Charles Joplin's performance. In a studio recording, there's the music, and there is, except for the things that specialists want to quibble about, balances and so forth, there is no historic occasion present whatsoever. This is a moment out of history. You can't get back into history from this moment. What you have then is a document. It's a question whether what we want to leave for the future is more documents or more historic occasions in which are a part of the history of their time. A document is not, fundamentally, which is a pure document is not, in the sense that I'm using the term. If you dwell on the documentary aspects of it, you reach a state of intellectual purity about it that can be attained no other way. You get a kind of performance that the concert hall rarely has to offer because there are too many accidentals involved. These can be completely ruled out in the studio. I'm just wondering whether, knowing this and working along these lines over a period of a generation or two will produce a totally new critical concept toward the works of the past. What would the composer himself have preferred? Although that, too, is partly irrelevant, I suppose.
It's no coincidence, though, that our concept of the tentative, transitory nature of the interpreter's role has been greatly altered during these last 50 or 60 years, which have seen the development of the recording. It's no accident that within the last half-century, modern musicology, with its growing emphasis on authenticity, has uncovered by a great deal of detailed research the stylistic premises which shaped the intentions of earlier composers. We've developed this exceptional concern for the musicological mission just at that time when we're first aware how infuriatingly transitory, how reflective of the passing modes and fashions are the prerequisites of the interpretive artist. We often listen today with amusement to the recordings of a vocalist or an instrumentalist of 40, 50 years ago, and we wonder how such superficial indulgence should ever have passed for persuasive style. We then become aware that the milieu which shapes the taste and the judgment of the interpretive artist is solely that of his own age, or at least has always been so in the past. So our current passion for authenticity, for official realization of the composer's intention, is entirely bound up with this intensely revealing and rather shocking view of how drastically the interpretive fashion has altered within the few years that we've been able to observe it via the recording. One determining factor in the role of a performing artist is the fact that his contact with the work being recorded will be, perhaps one should say can be, of a different character, treated to a different exposure than the more conventional relationship of an artist and the pieces that he plays in a concert performance. The contact of the recording artist with the music can be the result of an intense analytical scrutiny from which he prepares and records an interpretation of the composition. It's conceivable that for the rest of his life he'll never again take up or come in contact with that particular work. Now, this means that in the course of his lifetime, he'll necessarily encounter a much wider, much more varied range of repertoire than in all probability would be his lot in the concert hall. But most of all, the intensity of the interpreter's role encourages him to attempt a contact with the work which is very much like that of the composer's own relation with it. It permits him to encounter a particular piece of music and to analyze and to dissect that music in the most thorough way, to make it a vital part of his life for a relatively short period of that life, and then to pass on to some other challenge and to the satisfaction of some other curiosity. And yet still there are those who insist that the duty of the interpreter is only to capture some moment's inspiration, some special insight available to him alone, to somehow transmit it to others.
First of all, don't think that art should be governed by the media that are available to it. The media are just existing things that come along, that are improved, and perhaps help in a momentary transmission of art, but there's no reason why one should alter the nature of the art just by the media that are available to it. And I think that the very fact that music is made up of elements that require constant renewal, the fact that it's made up of essentially, in a way, time and movement, these things require, as part of their transmission, the fact that they must be done again and again, and therefore must be given new life at each doing.
Leon Fleischer, a young American pianist who's one of the finest interpreters of romantic piano music in this generation. Like his teacher, the incomparable Arthur Schnabel, Fleischer, though a frequent visitor to the recording studio, feels uncomfortable in the presence of the microphone. He refuses to concede that his interpretations have been in any way influenced by his career in the recording studio. He denies that his playing has altered in the slightest to accommodate the technique of recording, and he feels that the recordings which he makes are entirely supplementary to his public concerts.
The record, I think, retains vitality only as long as there is still something unfamiliar in it. The moment we get to a point in our relation with a record where we know exactly how each phrase is going to be shaped, how long the fermata is going to be held, well, the record has then served its purpose. It should be, thrown away because it no longer contains the essence of what music is, and that is this renewing life at each performance.
Diana Menuhin, the wife of the celebrated violinist, is at least partially in agreement with Leon Fleischer.
I'm afraid of pinning things down too much. I'm afraid of the modern, it sounds heretical, I suppose, the modern way of analyzing too much, the modern way of trying to catch what should be elusive. I'm thinking always of the studio reproduction and the record as something that crystallizes too much. I always put a record on when I do the few times and think, well, I do hope he plays differently tonight. I wonder if that trill will be as good as it was last time. Or I wonder if he's tired. And then I suddenly think, oh, no, of course not. Oh, no, he did that. He can't change. There's nothing new. There can't be anything new. Well, this is pushing it to a point ad absurdum. On the other hand, this is what I fear in the record. The feeling that whatever is spontaneous has gone.
Robert Offergeld has some rather special convictions about a performer named Johann Sebastian Bach.
I have my own convictions about Bach, as you know. I think he had probably more sense of public performance than any artist who ever lived. No matter how unused his audience was to his particular vocabulary, the kind of stylistic gesture he was making and so forth, it was there, and he wanted to communicate with it. When you write for an idealized concept of this sort, you're going to rule out, it seems to me, eventually, a certain amount of what in the past has been called, especially in romantic literature, the confessional aspect as relating to an audience that you wanted immediately to move humanly in some way or other.
I've often thought myself, as I've been through concerts all my life at the Charles since I was 2 years old, I went to concerts, that suddenly this awfully silly sound and sight of people beating their hands together was something I just couldn't take. I suddenly was withdrawn from the whole thing, and I thought, this is absolutely absurd. This is something so prescribed, so idiotic. What would it look like if some South Sea Islanders suddenly arrived here and saw a hall full of what's supposed to be sophisticated and advanced people making this extraordinary noise and beating their hands like walruses? Isn't it walruses who beat their hands like this? Or is it porpoises? I don't know. Well, those animals you know that go like this. And this is absolutely absurd. It's ridiculous. You cannot meet Beethoven on these grounds.
But, of course, it can still be argued that, for all its pertinence to the present, the recording does very little to assist the interpreter when he attempts to solve problems posed by works of the past for which no documentation in sound exists. The fact that in the past half-century we've been able to document the music of Richard Strauss or Gustav Mahler or Arnold Schoenberg as they heard it doesn't really help us solve the problems posed by the music of Bach or of Beethoven. It does, of course, condition us to accept the elusiveness of musical tradition, to concede that great composers often leave strangely indulgent interpretations of their own works in recorded form. But all this really proves is that the composer, as interpreter, is quite as human and as subject to the changing fashions of the years through which he lives as is the artist who is exclusively an interpreter. The last decade has provided a fascinating evidence for this view through the legacy which is now being prepared by Columbia Records of the complete works of Igor Stravinsky, conducted by the composer. For several years, Schuyler Chapin was the director of the Masterworks division of Columbia Records, and in that capacity he guided this enormous project of Stravinsky's works.
I think this is the key to the whole thing. For the first time, through records, through electronics and sound, a new medium has been given to the composer, so that now he has the thought in his mind. It is transcribed onto paper. He performs it. And finally, when he is ready to perform it, having blended the mind, the paper, and the interpretation, he comes to the electronic field and he says, now, this is how I hear it. Take an example of someone like Chopin. How many editions of Chopin does one go through, and how many different ideas are put down for each and every piece on paper? Last evening, I was looking at a Polish edition of the Chopin Mazurkas, and I think it was number 12. I turned to the back of the book, and there were at least 6 different authentic interpretations of what a group of bars meant. Authentic from Polish standpoint, German, French, English, American. The editor the Polish editor had the wit and the sense to write on the bottom, in essence, Mr. Performer, pay your money and take your choice. Now, that kind of loose thinking, that kind of personal involvement on the part of an editor or the imaginative wanderings of a performer are not going to be present in the case of a Stravinsky.
Some people feel that Stravinsky is not the best conductor of his own music, even though his forceful and rather detached way with that music is peculiarly faithful to certain implications of his composing style. Schuyler Chapin believes that the document which Stravinsky is leaving in the form of his recordings will minimize the degree to which his works will be subjected to interpretive variation in the future. If the recorded document has this effect, it will totally alter our conception of the interpreter's role. And the point raised by Schuyler Chapin is that regardless of the merits of Stravinsky's own conducting of his music, the scaffolding upon which future generations will build their view of that music has already been erected. He feels that it will not be subject to the same degree of historical flux as has been the case with earlier composers.
There have been many discussions about Stravinsky as a conductor. The opinions of this facet of his art have ranged from acceptable to excellent to gradations in between. The curious fact is that since we started this intense and important project, Stravinsky's technique as a conductor has improved with each record, so that now, apart from the documentary necessity of the work that we're doing, we actually are finding that he is turning out to be, in our contemporary sense, the very best interpreter of his own music. Take the Firebird. Now, if there is a piece of music better known in the general orchestral repertoire of 20th century work, I think you'd be hard put to it to name it. The Firebird is done everywhere by everybody. Stravinsky's recording of this, the last one that he did, and as he has announced to us, his final statement on this piece. Stravinsky's Firebird is diametrically opposed to what he did himself with it 20 years ago. It is a stately, slow, careful, building rhythmed performance that once heard is unforgettable. And I'd like to mention that I had a very interesting discussion with him about this very thing a year ago when I heard him do a performance of it here in New York City at the stadium. And the end, which is usually conductor's license for all kinds of rampant rhythms and wild imagining, the end moved as stately as a grand march. And I asked him afterwards why. And he took my wrist and he put his fingers on my pulse and he said, "Feel that." And I felt it, the regular beat of a heart. And he said, "That is the essence of the rhythm of this piece, a heartbeat. It should not change if you are healthy." And he said, laughing, "I am very healthy."
The recording, in making permanent the work of art, permits that venerable notion about the artist who writes for the future to become a very present reality. Recordings have so radically altered our notion of the chronological fittingness of things that they obviate many traditional judgments based on chronological succession. A composer whose work becomes preserved through recording assures to whatever parcel of posterity will express a curiosity about that work the most precise realization of his compositional intentions that technology can provide. By holding the present reality of an idea for some later observance, we're making it possible to span communicative gaps between individuals who respond to different traditions and between cultures that are not chronologically oriented. The transmissions of events and sounds around our planet has made us acutely aware of chronological differences exhibited by various cultures. quite extraordinary example of the way in which recordings can be used to circumvent the tyranny of chronological judgment is, I think, found in the case of Ludwig Dean, who combines the career of businessman with the avocation of composer, who lives in the bustling commercial center of Norfolk, Virginia, and whose strange and strangely moving music you are hearing now. Ludwig Dean is presently engaged in turning out a series of large-scale symphonic works which very much resemble the mammoth orchestral structures of Anton Bruckner. He's now written 8 of these symphonies, all of which exhibit precisely the same distaste for the musical mores of the 20th century. When a new work is finished, he arranges for a private recording of it by a European orchestra, distributes the acetates of the recording session to a small group of friends, and having thus ensured the perpetuation of his idea, calmly sits down and writes another symphony.
Well, to begin with, I must point out that I was born in Singapore and lived in Java, and my approach to music is perhaps a little different than the usual way. I may be called a loner. I did not have too much contact with musicians, certainly not when I was in Java. I learned a lot by listening to recordings and by studying study scores, and of course keeping my ears open. My prime principle in writing music is that I want to be sincere. I want to write only notes that I would never be ashamed of, no matter how many years later I would look back on them. I want to write exactly what I feel, and I do not want to manipulate my scores for special effect or for any kind of fashion especially. I do not believe in following fashion. I feel like almost like my works are my children. That is, of course, in a philosophical way, but just like a father would like to see his children to make their way in the world, so in the same sense I would leave my scores to posterity and hope that they would make their way in the musical world. I found that a certain regression in composing is possible. I have written works which tend to be more hark back further back into the 19th century. I have written works of that kind, like the Third Symphony. I feel that my music is neither bound to the past, nor is it particularly committed to the future. I found that in the beginning, in the earlier years, I listened a great deal to records, and I owe a great deal of my experience to records. And as far as my own recordings are concerned, I believe nothing could be better from a composer's standpoint, especially from a composer who does not have too much contact with the general public, that he should leave his works in well-recorded versions, to form something of a musical library which can be readily available to friends of his music and to other people that he thinks might enjoy them.
All creative artists claim when challenged that posterity will be their judge, that they have nothing but disdain for the limited vision of their present audience. But all too often the enormous force of opinion, of fashion molding that everywhere limits the play of imagination which an artist can enjoy, frames the view from which he writes and the purpose for which he writes. To remain in the modern world hermited against the pressures of fashion is possibly the most difficult task which any artist could set himself. The most significant thing that recordings have done, however, does not concern the performers or the composers who are involved with them. It concerns the listeners who make use of them. It's the extraordinary change in the participational level of the listener. He develops a listening situation in which the distractions and contradictory influences of the public listening room are removed, and the energy that he'd expend there warding off these distractions is rechanneled. The energy, the attention expended upon purely illusory social conquest in the public listening room achieves through the media of recording a much more purposeful redirection. I believe that the fact that music plays so pervasive a role in our daily lives will permit it to assume in our time a character as immediate, as utilitarian, as colloquial as language now holds in the conduct of our daily lives. The only way in which that degree of familiarity which language has long since established could be achieved by music is for it to become so familiar to us that whatever its style, its fundamental habits, its mannerisms, its tricks, its customary devices, its statistically most frequent occurrences, in other words, its cliches, whatever these things, they'll be instantly familiar and recognized by everyone able to hear. Because when there's a mass recognition of the cliché character of a vocabulary, there is not, it seems to me, any great need to be concerned that the listener will be saturated with the mundanities of those clichés. Quite the contrary, we don't value great works of literature less because we as men in the street speak the language in which they happen to be written. The very fact that so much of our daily conversation is concerned with the tedious familiarities of common courtesy, the mandatory conversation openers about the weather and so on, doesn't for a moment dull our appreciation of the potential glories of language. To the contrary, it sharpens it. It gives us a background against which that foreground, which is the habitat of the imaginative artist, stands in greater relief for the simple reason that in order to attain notice, it has to achieve a much more exceptional transcendence of the commonplace than was previously its requirement. It's my view that in the electronic age, the art of music will become much more viably a part of our lives, much less an ornament to them, and consequently change them much more profoundly. Marshall McLuhan, the director of the University of Toronto's Institute of Culture and Technology, has done a great deal of research into the question of audience participation in the electronic media, and he's achieved quite extraordinary insights into the way in which it determines the participational level of the audience.
The tendency of the audience, as it becomes more and more participant, is to eliminate content in the ordinary sense. Just as in abstract painting, representational content tends to go out. As the painting becomes more and more cartoon-like and abstract, this permits a very much higher degree of do-it-yourselfness and involvement on the part of the viewer. It demands that he do a great deal for himself. And by eliminating, you see, whereas if he merely recognizes some content in the painting, if he merely identifies content, his participation is minimal. If, on the other hand, he has to grope, as in a crossword puzzle, for every scrap of content, he becomes very participant in the creative process of making these kinds of structures. I think that is a strong tendency in the electric age in many levels for the what had been the audience to become very creatively engaged. We're moving into an age, for example, when children will be taught how to program computers, when the entire productive and decision-making process at the highest levels of industry can be entirely run from homes by housewives. Under a type of computer technology, there is not only no need to go to work, there is no need to have high-level tycoon executive types anymore. The sort of programming, that participant programming that goes along here permits quite non-specialist types to get into the activity of the highest and most potent industries. Just like the suggestion box, which increasingly involves the audience in the making process. But the tendency of the making process to take over as the content of works of art is very interesting.
Our present-day record devotees are already, as a breed, an extraordinarily self-reliant lot. They have opportunities for analytical judgment which afford them a responsible role in the recreative process. This responsibility exists because of the physical circumstances through which the listener can control and modify the nature of his experience. 40 years ago, the listener had the option of turning the switch which said on and off, and if he had a particularly up-to-date machine, perhaps modulating the volume just a bit. Today, on the other hand, a quite extraordinary variety of controls are available, all of which are designed to encourage the preferential conditions which the listener can impose upon the performance that he hears. And the quasi-analytical controls that the current hi-fi bug is offered are as nothing when compared to the participational possibilities which the listener will have at his disposal once the current techniques of electronic music have been appropriated by the home listening device.
The audience becomes increasingly composer, just as it does in all other feedback relationships like market research. Audience becomes maker of design in products, but simply by getting closer to the involvement in the making of objects. So that I think the same is happening in any electric circuit. Audience becomes more and more creative, more and more part of the making process simply by identification with the initial performance. I think that we have some very strange examples of recorded music causing new images to emerge, and perhaps we might think for a moment of the effect of the omnipresence of little transistors and so on our own children. The uses they have for these kinds of auditory effects seem very mysterious to their parents. They use this incredible noise for privacy. They use it to create little Lebensraum of their own, their little world. Music, wouldn't you say, has a tremendous power to create its own world, to exclude other worlds. So perhaps the children aren't entirely wrong in pretending to be able to use this as a means of concentrating on their homework. They control by white noise, as it were, all the other noises in the environment. There is a very strange result of recording.
Whether or not things will work out quite this way, whether or not the listener will choose to exercise these specific prerogatives is hardly the point. The real issue is that as this media evolves, it becomes available for situations in which the quite properly self-indulgent participation of the listener will be encouraged. So this leads us to assume, then, that the old distinctions about the various classes of the musical hierarchy, distinctions that separated the composer and the performer, and both of them from the listener, will to a large extent become outmoded. The prospects of the recording are such as to suggest that an overlapping of function will become the next major force in musical activity. Or does this then contradict the fact that since the Renaissance, the separation of functions, specialization, has been the professional lot, and that the medieval status of the musician as one who created for the sake of his own enjoyment has long since been supplanted by our post-Renaissance orgy of musical sophistication? I believe that these two concepts are not necessarily contradictory, although the overlapping at various levels of professional and lay responsibility in the creative process does tend to produce a set of circumstances which superficially are not unlike those of the largely unilateral participation of the pre-Renaissance world. In fact, it's deceptively easy to draw such parallels, to assume that the entire adventure of the Renaissance and of the world which it created was a gigantic historical error. But we are not returning to a medieval culture. The future will not negate the immediate past, but will build upon it, as it has always done. The significance of some cultural pattern in the immediate future may well call to mind the rather more distant past and seem to circumvent the immediate past, but the difference will be very much more significant than the similarity. What will happen, rather, is that entirely new participational areas will develop, and that many more hands will be required to achieve the execution of a particular work of art, so that instead of representing the direct statement of a creative person, acting as an interpretive person, and for the pleasure of himself as listening person, the circuit of participation in music of the future will create an enormous number of participational responsibilities. The second thing that will happen is that because of this complexity, because so many different hands are in fact merged in the final result of the work of art, the specialized information concepts which define the nature of identity within the historical process will become very much less imposing. We see this today at many different levels, all the way from that at which the composer participates in making his own interpretation permanent, as he does in purely electronic music, to the anonymous contributions of engineers and producers whose special overlapping functions alter and modify the end result of our electronic listening or viewing. The most hopeful thing about this process, about the inevitable lapse of the identity factor in the creative situation, is that it will encourage a climate in which the biographical character of the historical persons involved will no longer be the cornerstone for subsequent assumptions about the work, and consequently permit an infinitely more altruistic, if you like, and in any case, extra-historical participation. In fact, the whole question of individuality in the creative situation, the question about the way in which the creative act results from and absorbs and reforms individual opinion and individual action, will be subjected to a most radical reconsideration.
With the recorder, the electronic drum, as it were, all the music of the world becomes available at any moment, just like an encyclopedia. We begin to develop a vast tribal encyclopedia of musics. Music becomes plural. You can't speak of it any longer as the singular. And as an international language, that old pet cliche of the 19th century that music is the universal, the international language, with the recorder we know this is not so. That it takes enormous training to learn the idiom or to understand. Well, for example, what we call Eastern music is, to our Western ears, scarcely music at all. On the other hand, it is very subtly adjusted to vocal and colloquial pattern, in which the nuance is extremely tricky and elusive. Now, our Western music, by accentuating instruments at the expense of the human voice, more or less obliterated our sensitivity to speech as music. Because, in actual fact, the spoken word is music, pure music, at any time. It is a form of singing. If you want to test that, all you have to do is slow down speech at any moment and you're singing. Any word sustained for a moment, you say the word, any word at all, just slowed down, is song. Now, what we did obviously in Western music over the past 5 centuries or 4 centuries was to speed up some effects far beyond the ordinary speech level to pull out virtuoso instruments for solo effects, something which no Arab or Chinese would dream of doing. He wants to subordinate all musical effect to the corporate colloquial speech. Now, I think we're moving that way in our own Western world.
We are too close to the invention of electronic material to be able properly to judge its effect upon our world. But when all of the fascination, all of the novelty that this material offers has passed away, when the physical circumstances that it creates have opened a new world of activity and participation to millions of people who previously were strangers to the creative act, we may be sure that what will be most profoundly affected will be our own sense of history. Our own stubborn concern about the fittingness and conclusiveness of our present will be disturbed precisely because of that encyclopedic awareness of other cultures and of other time concepts. And you can be sure that the function of the recording as the basis of a new archival sense will have much to do with the consolidation of this historical definition. It seems to me that many of these views are summed up by Robert Oppergill.
The older I get, the more convinced I am that art is possibly the most luminous gesture against oblivion and death that mankind has achieved. There are very moving things done by inarticulate people in the face of death, but they are only realized and made explicit to the rest of us in art. I think there have been periods in history, or the early Christian centuries and so forth, where there was a kind of emotional shortcut between man's sense of his present life and his conception of immortality, which made art almost impossible. As we have had less and less religious activity, I don't mean in the organized sense either, I mean just in the average personal sense, we find more and more people realizing themselves, realizing their aspirations, and many almost inexpressible things in art rather than in religious experience. I am frequently impressed reading a great deal of modern poetry, hearing a great deal of some of the more avant-garde modern musical experiences to find how much of mysticism of one kind or another there is in them. I think the most heroic modern musicians, people who have written and worked with a great deal of dedication and without very many illusions in the 19th century sense, are almost the pattern of sanctity in our time. I equate the greatest performers, the greatest composers, with much earlier figures. I equate them now in my own thinking, my own private mythology, with prophets and with people who had various kinds of religious experience in the past. I think it's as serious as that. I think it's that important to the race, the human race. I think that recording is going to be read in the light of revelation in the future.
Dialogue on the Prospects of Recording, a documentary for radio written and narrated by Glenn Gould. Heard in conversation with Mr. Gould were Schuyler Chapin, Ludwig Dean, Leon Fleischer, John Hammond, Marshall McLuhan, Diana Menuhin, Paul Myers, and Robert Oppergeld. Musical examples were from works by Bach, Mussorgsky, Schoenberg, Frank Martin, Dick Reimacher, Henri Pousseur, Igor Stravinsky, Ludwig Dean, Lukas Voss, and Ludwig van Beethoven. This program was produced by Irving Glick. Technical operations, David Horaney. Program organizer, Carl Little. Harry Mann is speaking.